persons who value this statute know all that. That's the first thing. Because these monuments do some form of education for us, don't they? I mean, you take little children in the park to see monuments, you take newcomers to see monuments, and they have some meaning. So what meaning am I expressing if I look at the statue of someone who fought against the government, who was a traitor to the government, who was a secessionist? And the grounds on which that secession took place, given Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech, was that he used the word Negro. These people, my predecessors, my ancestors, were not equal to white people and would never be, and that this was the only government that was to be established on the basis of race and race distinction. So what that means to me is something very different. So was it erected immediately after the Civil War? Well, no. So why does it come along X number of years afterwards? So some historians are suggesting that these things reinscribe values that are lost. That Mitch Landrieu, in his famous, now I guess, op-ed piece, says that this is, these statues become paeans or, I don't know, icons perhaps too, in a common sense, not in anything sacred, but sacred in another sense, I guess, to a lost cause. And a lost cause, the old phrase, the South will rise again. Well, what that means to some people's ears and what it means to 38 million people in the United States, to their ears, are very different sorts of things.
Yes. Actually, most of the statues were erected after immediately after the Civil War. Most of the statues to the Confederacy were erected between 1890 and 1920. So it really it was much later and had to do with, Heather knows more about this. Heather's forgotten more about this than I know. But it's really to the creation of that whole idea of the lost cause. So it's really I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, I don't. Somebody who's a historian, please take over.
Well, I guess I probably won't answer this from a historian's perspective, but it's more along the question of word. So I don't know that the meanings of the statues or the monuments actually do change, right? Because I think it's more of a question of at what points do the intended meanings of the statue become or remain concordant with society's normal values, and at what points do they become discordant? Because I think about when these monuments were constructed in the 1890s, as you said, the 1890s to the 1920s, those people who the monuments were intended to intimidate knew exactly what they meant. Right? But I think that at some point, obviously, the monuments just become part of the landscape. People don't, I grew up in the South. I mean, I must have passed Confederate memorials on a daily basis almost, and it just didn't register for me. But we're at this particular historical moment now where, and we talk a lot about the purpose of creating these monuments, and we have to historically contextualize why they were created at the time that they were, why they were built at the time that they were. I think it's also important to historically contextualize why there's a response or resistance to it now. I think it only partly has to do with the fact that these are commemorating the Civil War heroes, but I think it's also I also think that it is a response to a backlash, right? A white supremacist backlash, to be frank. And of course, everybody who voted for Trump is not a white supremacist, but his election has empowered white supremacists, and I think that has certainly intensified this opposition to Confederate memorials. So it's as much, from my perspective, it's as much about response to.
So let me ask you. I'm going to ask a further question then. So let's say Hillary Clinton had won, and that the whole thing that happened in Charlottesville hadn't happened. Would we be here tonight?
Well, I think some communities might have, right? Because Charleston, South Carolina certainly was after the murder the congregants of Emmanuel Anglican Church in the summer of 2015, right? So the battle around the Confederate flag. I think New Orleans still would have been there, but I also think that it's really been intensified and amplified in the wake of Trump's election.
My role here is to talk, I think, about iconoclasms of the past. And there have been lots of, this is an iconoclasm. There have been lots of successful ones in the past. It sounds facile to say that the statues come down when the time is right, but I think the time is right as it was in the 16th century in some places for the Protestant Reformation, as it was at the fall of the Soviet Union. The time was right and the statues came down. Sometimes the statues are taken into people's homes where they continue to be revered. Sometimes they're taken to museums, which I think lots of people are suggesting about these statues. It's important that we don't lose the story of what the statues signify, when they were put up, and what they mean subsequently. But people will continue to pay attention quietly and let them.
Craig, you were shaking your head there.
Yeah, okay, yes. So I think there's, as people have been speaking, I think there are three angles that are emerging in my head. So to me, the question about who gets to, who gets to have the say about these monuments reflects that question that many people in the so-called alt-right have raised, which is, why are you trying to change the past? And I think there's a ridiculousness to that question. And I think an analogy you could give is, it's ridiculous in the same sense that if I had a desk that I was working at and I had a picture to a deceased loved one that I've had for 10 years, and I decided to take that down, that doesn't change two very permanent things. One, that loved one existed. And two, it doesn't change the fact that anyone who visited me for those 10 years and I guess took an interest in what's on my desk would have known that that was there. The past is the same. In this sort of situation that we're in, the books on the Confederacy still exist. The books on white supremacy and history still exist. And they'll continue to exist in special places like museums or in private homes or whatever. But then there's the second angle, which is the interesting angle, or challenging angle. Because there's a distinction, I think, between the past, which is just, I think one philosopher said, the ocean of things that have happened, past events, right? Events that have happened. And the story that we tell about them, which is how we represent it to ourselves, and that is history. And I think that it's important to maintain that there is no unmediated access to the past, and access to telling a story, and having a story to tell, I guess, in the first place, dictates what sort of monuments we put up. So, to give another example based on this broad, weird one that I gave about the desk, why do they come down? Black people want the statues to come down, in case y'all don't know, because they are racist. The people who are in there are racist. We do not like walking past racism. Right? That's the simple answer. A more complex answer to that question is that the reasons that Black people are now advocating for these monuments to come down is because Black people have not had the opportunity to tell a story about America. My uncle remembers segregation. My grandmother remembers segregation, Vietnam, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. She remembers her grandparents who were slaves. I am completely aware of the phenomenon of mass incarceration that puts particularly black male bodies into prison. The story about America has not been one that Black people have had the opportunity to tell. And if we do claim to be a United States, it is time to hear what those voices have to say. And as someone who's a Catholic theologian, I'm always thinking about procedure and about how we do this in a just way. And I think about the preferential option for the poor. When we're making a decision, we take into, we give more weight to those who have been oppressed and how we allocate resources and how we make decisions. I think that applies right here, right? Because in the same loop-de-loop that we're doing when we talk about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, the point is that Black lives have not had the opportunity to matter significantly. It is not to deny that white bodies matter, right? You go to your doctor and you say, your arm hurts. If your doctor says, but all of your body parts matter, you're going to not see that doctor. Yes. So, in the same way that Black Lives Matter activists have pointed up to us the reality of racism and white supremacy, and again in our midst, we have to respond to what Black people are saying, particularly as Catholics, who privilege the view of those who have been oppressed. And I think that allows us to have that story. I think I've talked too long, so we'll say it.
So from theology to history, Heather.
So you'll be shocked to hear our work is political. So think about it. When statues come down, that signifies regime change. That's what that means. So what does it mean that these statues at this moment are coming down? And that's what fascinates me. If you think about to my mind, what we're really talking about is who has the right to have a say in American society. And that's absolutely why those statues went up. Look at them. I mean, it's really creepy, by the way, sitting down here with Lee over your head. It's actually quite uncomfortable, and that's deliberate. Look at him. He's on a horse, which is, of course, the way that the Caesars were represented when they destroyed republics. And that's deliberate because, of course, he's not on the ground like the rest of us. He's up in the air on an expensive animal, looking down on us, an animal which, by the way, can trample us underfoot. And that's exactly what that was supposed to mean from the 1890s to the 1920s, when African-American voting was being wiped off the American map, with the argument that, in fact, you should not allow African-Americans, men, women aren't in the equation yet. They're really going to be part of this language much later. But you shouldn't allow them to vote because they are, by definition, corrupting society, because they want wasteful things like roads and schools and hospitals. And the only way you can pay for those things is with tax dollars that are going to be paid for by white people. And that's going to redistribute wealth from white people to Black people. And that's when those statues went up, and that's why they became such a symbol of the modern Republican Party, which of course rose to power on this exact same argument. So what I see when I see people not only talking about the monuments, but also talking about Black Lives Matter, for example, is indeed, yes, the return of African American voices to American society, but far more than that. Because if you think about the concept, and this is a little bit of a leap, of Black Lives Matter, like African American lives have been wasted and crushed in America for a very long time, and it did not get headway. Are we being recorded?
Yes.
Are you going to put it on the internet?
Yes.
Never mind.
Well, one way of tracking that, of course, is Carolyn Anderson's book.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Well, I was going to give a very specific example that I'd rather not put on the internet. If you turn the cameras off, I'll tell you it's a horrible story, but it's an illustrative one. So why do Black Lives Matter suddenly get traction in this moment? Why do those monuments, which have never ceased to be offensive, get traction in this moment? And what I see is not simply African American lives, although they are the symbols, of course, of this moment, but also women's lives and immigrants' lives and poor white people's lives who have been left behind since 1980. If you look at the statistics, it is horrific, saying this is the moment we are taking back our government because our voices matter. Not only our voices in history, but our voices in what our government is supposed to do, because we've got such an extremist moment that we really are looking at a government that looks quite like this dude here on the horse, trampling the rest of us. And taking down these statues says we're not just taking back the narrative, we're taking back our government. So I'm actually more hopeful today than I've been in my entire career.
Are you making the analogy to the figure or to the horse in making that?
Getting rid of the whole thing.
Let me push back a little bit, because I'm a historian of religious ideas. I'm always nervous when people want to erase memories of the past. Like, you know, when we all know that when Hitler came to power, as chancellor, the first thing he did is he ordered all the statues in Berlin taken down, because he wanted to put up what he called a, quote, more correct understanding of the area past. So he wanted to erase those memories put up by the Kaisers and other people to the German past. Yale University, as you know, had a huge debate about whether Calvin College should be, started by a janitor, it was actually started by a janitor at Calvin College, whether they should be named, they did. Georgetown University decided rather than rename Healy Hall, which is one of the oldest buildings at Georgetown, the big one you see come in, rather than do that, they were going to create scholarships for the descendants of all those slaves that they could descend, and they were also going to start regular courses to talk about how Georgetown benefited from the sale of those slaves in terms of making Georgetown wealthy. Just returned to Boston for a moment. So should we rename, and this is, since we do know about Peter Daniel now, should we rename Daniel Hall?
Can I just say, I think there's a huge difference between things that are on private property and things that are on public property. Dude here's on public property. And as far as I'm concerned, we should have no monuments in this country to anybody who took up arms against the country.
Yes, exactly.
And so aside from, slavery is a different issue. You can talk about where we should put that in public monuments, but any Confederate does not belong in any public space under any circumstances. And this is the moment when I always say my people fought for the Confederacy, even though I don't have the accent.
I agree. I do think this is an exceptional example, and I am also a little nervous about going after every kind of public monument, and I just don't mean statuary, but the parks that are named after particular individuals, dorm residence halls on university campuses and things of that nature. But yes, like you, I mean, I tend to think of an image comes to mind. I mean, we're not talking about when one particular faction of a regime kind of comes into power and ends up kind of tearing out, any references to the other faction from history books and things like that. We're not talking about that kind of erasure, because we're not talking about erasure. We're talking about removing them from their pride of place in American society. And for me, just the fact that a discussion around this, which, by the way, the irony here is that there's been much more discussion about the removal of the monuments than there was any discussion about the erection of them. Right? And there are more stakeholders, community stakeholders involved in these discussions than were allowed to have any input when these monuments went up at the turn of the 20th century. But for me, the fact that even discussing this has elicited the kind of response from white nationalists that we saw in Charlottesville, I think is even more proof that we need to move with a great deal of urgency to take these symbols down.
On your point about continuing to tell the story, you started with the German example. Stay in Germany for a minute. They might be a model to us for how to come to terms and continue to tell the story of a shameful, shameful past. Never again. And the Germans are doing everything, I think, admirably in their power to make sure that from a young age, German kids learn the history and can say never again. After the weekend's elections, I'm feeling not so great about the German example, but it's not because of education, I think.
I think it's hard to name principles in advance for how and under what circumstances you would take down a monument. I think it really does depend on the reason, right? So obviously, people make monuments for to commemorate positive memories, like Arthur Ashe in front of, in New York at Flushing Meadows, right? Then people who put up monuments to commemorate negative events, like the Holocaust, right? And so I don't think that, because an event is dehumanizing, that's the only reason, or that's even a conclusive reason for why something should go, like why a monument should come down. But I do agree with Martin about the discourse. There is, the quality of public discourse seems to be very important for how we measure the justice that occurs in these transactions, right? So I'm thinking about all the conversations, I mean, minus the Islamophobia, but the conversations that we had around the 9/11 monument, people wanted to rebuild the monument, people wanted to rebuild the towers, people wanted to build monuments, people wanted to do nothing, and if you've been there, you see what we have now. But it was a participatory conversation, and crucially, it was a future-oriented conversation, right? Like when people talk about removing monuments, they're not talking about the past. The question that they ask is, how do we move forward, right? It's as forward-thinking as having a heart attack and saying, what do I do now, right? You might make changes to your life, you might regret what happened in the past, but you might overall think about the future differently. And I think that's what monuments do. They orient us to thinking about the future differently.
But the past is never, the past is never really past.
Different.
It lives in the present. And the issue could be that if things were different in the present in which we live, then maybe we could come to terms with the past. But we're continuing the same sort of negatory behavior toward people in the present that we did in the past. So if you think of this comment by Saadia Hartman from Columbia, that I live in the past that slavery created. Well, this is true. This is part of Georgetown's admission, that they are living off of the fruits of a very large sale of black Catholic human beings. And other Catholics sold them. And so there's a way in which, in terms of our own sort of church relations, I mean, this is another dimension of this. It's where we live, how we live, is because of the past that we have. If we had had a different kind of past, we may not be living as we live today. So if a monument seeks to reinscribe that past of slavery onto the present, this is the point of these recent, establishment of monuments. And we can, here in Boston, we can also look, I mean, there are statues of Union soldiers around the city. And there are, the famous regiment, the
104th.
54th, down at the Common, right across from the State House, which is a beautiful monument, which in fact has a kind of a semblance of really of unity, of people attempting. I mean, prescind for a moment from the asymmetrical application of power in that instance. Black men cannot be officers, but there is here someone who took it upon himself to be with these people, if the story is true, and to do something positive. So there can be ways in which that sort of monument read against this monument gives us something to dialogue about in a way. But I think the participants in the dialogue, though, have to be, first of all, schooled in history in the first place. I mean, it seems to me that sort of conversation about change, there's a lot of education for us all. So if you ask students, did you learn about slavery in high school, everybody says something like, well, yes, and then, it was really unfortunate, and then it was over. But it's not over, and that's the point. It's not over.
John, let me pick up two things you said. First of all, the William Faulkner quote, who said, I think it was Faulkner who said, the past is not over, indeed, the past is not really past.
Yeah.
I think Faulkner is right. So if the past is not really past, what do we do when we remove a monument? How do we make sure that the past isn't erased? So we say the Robert E. Lee monument is offensive, we're going to take it down. What do we do to make sure that that memory is not, the memory of what happened there is not erased? And that was the argument of Georgetown about, we're not going to rename people, we're going to say this building was built with the sale of slaves. No. And secondly, who, again, one of the first questions asked, who gets to have that? As you pointed out, not everybody, Americans are famous for not knowing their own past.
Right.
I was at Yale last 2 weekends ago, and I went to see the new college's Yale boat, and I was standing in front of one just spectacular new building. And I stopped him on the graduate, and I said, what's this? And he said, this is Franklin College. I said, how cool is that? Aretha Franklin has her own college at Yale. And he looked at me like I was not, he had no idea of the sort of interstices of the joke I was making there. Who gets to determine that?
Yeah.
And we're overeducated intellectuals, so we can talk about it, but I mean, not everybody is an academic. I mean, is everyone who showed up at the rally at Charlottesville, are they part of this conversation? They have a right to help determine? I mean, I don't know.
Both Heather and Craig said something very meaningful, that they were both implicated in this past, personally. And I think that's another dimension. We think in Massachusetts, I'm not from Massachusetts, but I've lived here a long time now. We think we're not implicated in this history, and so now Peter Faneuil, this is a great discovery to us. But we forget that John Winthrop's brother-in-law is writing to him, urging him to buy slaves. And we have no large agricultural crop here that could use slave labor. But it was the idea of participating in a kind of, horizon, Weltanschauung, that existed in the nation at the time, that everyone, there wasn't a nation yet. It was a series of disparate colonies.
So only Boston College could use Weltanschauung, and nobody back.
But the thing would be, these people though were seeking to, there's a certain kind of push upwards, push down. And I think if you're talking about people remembering and you're talking about, you know, the memory, then where's the personal examen, if you wish, for all of us in some way? I mean, we're all implicated in this in somehow, some fashion, we are.
So what I would say about who decides is, in a democracy, the people decide. Every single person decides. And to move it away from the monuments, and one of the things that fascinates me is Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Because he was putting the $20 bill in a really, really profound movement of the people against government by control by the very wealthy. He's put on there during the Depression. And he's supposed to symbolize the labor. Well, of course, we know as historians that this is ridiculous. He wants to break the bankers in favor of the slave owners, is what he wants to do. But he represents the Democrats in that, and it's a really popular thing to do. Now, of course, we look at Andrew Jackson and we think, we do not want to carry him in our back pocket, or most of us don't want to carry him in our back pocket. And I think that history, to some degree, lives in the documents, lives in the books. But the meaning of that history is different according to what moment you're in. And that's, in a democracy, we don't have somebody coming and saying, I'm going to chisel the faces off all the statues. We say, what does it mean to people at the time? But it's vitally important that every voice is included. And I don't just mean in the history books, I mean in public debate, because that's where the narratives are made in the first place. And we're in this kind of Wild West moment where all sorts of different voices are coming to the fore. The internet is doing that. I think it's actually enormously productive, but as we know, we are discovering more and more that certain voices have been privileged clandestinely to change what our narrative is. And I think we're still in this Wild West moment where we haven't yet had seen everything precipitate out, but it will, and with luck, we'll be able to create a new American past that includes more voices.
Can I ask a question, Heather, about this, about the timeline? Of course that's right, the people making the decision. I heard recently that at the time of the Loving decision, the Supreme Court decision against miscegenation, 70% of the American people thought that was wrong. I wonder, at the time...
Why don't you explain what that is in case somebody...
The decision was Loving. There's a movie about it now. It's an aptly named situation. I think an African American and a white person were married and were accused of miscegenation, which is a crime, or was then a crime. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that black people and white people could in fact get married. 70%, evidently, of the American population at the time thought that was a wrong decision. So what about the voice of the people? How about Brown versus the Board of Education? Would that decision have been made if it had been left up to the people?
Yeah, essentially with Brown versus Board of Education is the famous Supreme Court case that said that separate but equal education between white students and students of color was illegal, and it resulted in all those sides to impeach Earl Warren and all that.
But that's, well, what I think about that is, of course, I believe in democracy, so I believe in the system. And mind you, I think the system is terribly out of whack. I think we're in a terrible crisis in the moment, probably the worst one we've ever been in. with the possible exception of the Civil War, but I'm not sure I would give up that ground. But remember why Earl Warren did this in '54 for Brown v. Board, and that is because the people turned out overwhelmingly for Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's very inclusive vision of what American society should be. And Earl Warren himself was a Republican governor of California. And when they handed down that decision, it was a unanimous decision. So, you know, is the system perfect? But is it self-correcting? Until now it has been. Right now it is not. And so I guess at the end of the day, I don't agree with everything that happens for sure. And I would suggest that even more suggestive of this moment was the 1890s and the Melville Fuller Court, which nobody remembers because every single thing they had done was overturned or ignored because it was so outrageous, everything they did. It was just like one thing after another. But I think that theoretically, and until now it has worked, that a system of human self-determination, the way it was set up, or has been continually in America, is self-correcting.
So what I hear people saying, I'm going to get back to quickly. What I hear saying then is the question of who gets to decide in a democracy is the messy process of public debate, which is what we're having. Is that what
Fair public debate, and you know, when you privilege a set of certain voices,
Informed public debate.
Yeah.
So you know, people, and
Fair
again, Americans fear that we just have profound ignorance of our history, right? And so the people who show up at Charlottesville and you want to make the argument that the Civil War wasn't based on saying, no, I don't think they get a say.
Well, the informed part, of course, is the big problem. But Craig, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
You know, I don't share the optimism about the democratic process at the moment. And neither do you. I mean, you've said this, like, so I don't want to.
This is alarming because you're the youngest person.
I know. Just watching the news, man. I think of democracy as a horizon, or as just out another, if you look at, for instance, as a tradition, is something that we live into. And I think that there are too many facile ways to invoke democracy that shut down what we think is a reflection of the cause of justice. Right? Civil rights, every civil rights victory has been won in the courts. And I'm thinking about the only like big democratically progressive thing that's been won by the people. I'm thinking of Ireland and same-sex marriage. That's the last recent one I can think of as a country making a massively progressive statement. In the United States, I don't think that's been our story at all. And when I think about the writing, of course, of Ta-Nehisi Coates, his most recent piece about, you know, the first white president, I think is the title of it. Even if I disagree with the extreme pessimism that he has in that view, the point is that there is this allegiance to whiteness that gets in the way of white people entering into solidarity with persons of color. I get this email every morning from the Public Religion Research Institute, and it features a number of statistics that get more and more horrifying when they talk about race and class. But one of them that they say often strikes me to the core is white people's perception of bias against whites. White people think it's equal to, or worse than in some cases, black people. And black people have a complete opposite view.
So there was a famous case 2 weeks ago in the New York Times that it says, I forget who it was, one of the president's cabinet was saying, the question about the prejudice against whites in terms of university, and it was a picture of the cabinet, and it was all these 50-plus white men sitting at a table. Yeah. No irony intended, I guess.
And again, so I think the point I want to make by talking, I guess, about history and democracy as a horizon is that, you know, we do need leaders to help step forward and make an argument that will allow for people to have a common story, to share this horizon coming together in black and white. Because until that happens, we're not going to have the public discourse of the quality we need to talk about the monuments. We're still going to retrench over and over again into different types of rhetorics where black people talk about racism and white supremacists, and white people talk about the Southern way of life, which, by the way, is like the most amazing euphemism of all time. Like, it's just that's really what people are digging their heels into, and until people can begin to see each other as people across these dividing lines, it's not gonna work.
So if you're saying that most of the folks here say they trust the messy public processes of democracy, if you don't trust it, what should we be doing then? If you're not confident that the messy public processes of democracy are not going to get us where we need to get on this.
I think there's a short-term version and a long-term version. I think right now, when I think about, like, for example, like, my evaluation of Donald Trump's presidency is that he just wants to undo everything President Obama has done. I can defend that some other time. But when I see that happening, what Donald Trump is showing us is how much power we've invested outside the democratic process and in the executive branch of government. That every day I look at my phone and think, oh my goodness, what is happening with the Affordable Care Act once again, right? Our government is run by Mike Pence running the Senate, and whatever, who's the guy from Arizona? The one that had the... John McCain. Whatever those two people think becomes the law. Like, that to me is scary. So I'm trying to, like, think, okay, for short term, we need people to help shut this down. That way we can get into an equilibrium to get into the long-term horizon that we need to bring back some of this justice that we're talking about.
And in the long term?
That's the long term.
So just one thing, I think you're right, we're in a terrible moment, but this was a deliberate strategy that was constructed in the 1950s. It was implemented in the 1960s through Barry Goldwater. It took the White House with Ronald Reagan in 1980, and it took the Congress in the early 90s with Newt Gingrich. They deliberately divided the American people with the idea that you had to turn poor white people against poor black people in order to make sure that you were able to roll back the New Deal. This is a peculiar moment, and it is a constructed moment. And so do we have to be here? Absolutely not. We need a new narrative. And the question for me has been, for 2 years, poor Martin's heard, how are those narratives constructed? And I actually believe that that they bubble up from below. That what happens is you get a political system where leaders speak only to a certain constituency until that constituency is so isolated from the majority of Americans that other people start to complain, and somebody who wants to get power listens to those other voices and starts to talk. And you know, the number of things I have found fascinating. We've got a number of Republicans who have done amicus briefs before the Supreme Court against gerrymandering. Now, they're perfectly happy to have Republicans elected, but they're concerned about the fact they're losing legitimacy. So, you know, I'm seeing it in places, and again, I think the veneer has been ripped off, but, and things are bad. But to my mind, they were far worse when nobody thought this was going on. When it was, you know, African American men did not end up in prison yesterday.
Yes.
And the attacks on black people,
That's
you know,
not
it was Reagan, you know, it started, I mean, it's been there all along, but the real crash and burn started with Reagan, and no one paid any attention. So people are finally paying attention.
The other thing here, though, to interject, is not to lose sight that we are a racialized society. We racialize everybody who comes here. Whether you thought you were Polish when you arrived, you stop being Polish, or Italian, you become white. And if you are from Nigeria or Congo or wherever, you suddenly find yourself becoming black. But there are other people here. I mean, the indigenous people. I mean, those people here are marginalized beyond the pale. I mean, they're completely marginalized in our thinking.
Two poorest counties in America,
And
region.
And they really, I mean, for instance, the Standing Rock protest brought that to mind. They reinserted themselves into the national consciousness. At what cost? The other thing is that Asian people are not just honorary white people. I mean, you know, if you're watching the Vietnam saga, you know, yesterday was this Japanese American who was born in an internment camp, and who goes off to Vietnam as a young soldier. So we have a history of racialization joined to Americanization that really, yes, the angst here are these three groups of people, the indigenous people, the enslaved people, and the colonists and their descendants. That's where we are right now in a certain way, at each other's throats almost. But we've got to figure out some other way to broaden our conversation and understand that what holds us together really are our allegiance to a certain set of documents. I mean, that's really, well, that's right, a constitution and a declaration, flawed constitution, flawed declaration, but the so-called positive declared principles there really are what we say we espouse, and that's our dream, that's our hope, that's our experiment. So we shouldn't lose sight in this of other peoples. I mean, I get what the monuments are about. They're aimed at a particular group, but other people also fall under that sort of targeting, because if somebody's not available, somebody else is. And so I think we shouldn't forget that in trying to think about a large experiment that democracy really is, for us at least. We have such I'm not a historian. This all seems to me to be it's like a patchwork of desires, but we've economized and commodified those desires. What might have been a desire for life has now become a desire for things. And so I think there's a way in which some sort of conversation and education is necessary. I agree with you.
Yeah, but I think you're right about the long, messy process of public debate. Henry Louis Skip Gates at Harvard has this famous essay, who was at one time the director of the African American Studies Program at Harvard. He said, for white people, America was the city on the hill. It was the promise, it was the golden city. It was the place where everything was going to be right. That was never the case for African Americans. America was never the city on the hill.
And not for most other people, and not for most other people as well.
And so the question is, once the messy debate starts, we're not just talking about public monuments, we're talking about our own mythic understanding of what America was. E. Cummings who said America's promises. Well,
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of promises for white people, but it was a different kind of promises. So I think the messiness is going to extend even to our civil religion and how we understand the purposes of America. Let me ask you one last question, then I'm going to open up to them. If race is the analog to religion in Northern Ireland, okay, so race is that big, deep divide that in Ireland is Catholic and Protestant. Does race trump other issues? No pun intended, I'm sorry. That was quite unconscious, or at least maybe recording this. Does race override other considerations in our debates about the meaning of our past?
Malcolm X thought it did. You don't catch hell because you catch hell because you're black. Doesn't matter if you've got a PhD, doesn't matter if you've got a big house and money in your pocket. That's why you catch hell. If Savon Glover could develop on Broadway a tap dance that showed Colin Powell unable to get a cab, yeah, race trumps.
Everyone agree?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think
It's a point.
no, of course. And I think of John Hope Franklin's famous comment when he was chairing the Civil Rights Commission, because the Civil Rights Commission during the Clinton presidency, that yes, the United States cut its eye teeth on race. Right? That was the quote or something along those lines. But I also think that by thinking about it in those terms, it also obscures the intersectionality of identity and the intersectionality of oppression, right? So, so if we talk about race being the principal mode through which people are oppressed, then inevitably that drives Malcolm X. When Malcolm X was talking about black men, right? He wasn't necessarily talking about
and that's exactly
so they really kind of get lost in that, and so we can kind of think about people who inhabit other identities being marginalized within this larger narrative that race is the principal axis of power and oppression in the U.S.
It seems to me that what was baked into America from its very beginning in the concept of human freedom, which is a radical idea in the 1700s, the idea that everybody is equal, was baked into it the idea that you couldn't have human equality unless you also had inequality, that we all couldn't be equal unless you all were unequal. And the trick in America has always been deciding who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. And who were the bad guys almost always was women, and then almost always African Americans, and then Indians, and then, interestingly enough, you're talking about race lines in American history. After the Civil War, most of the Western states and territories did not believe the 14th Amendment covered Indians or Chinese. They quite literally said, off the bat, well, they're not going to be equal in this state. And that, I think, is part of what I study and like to play with in the stuff I do in public, is redefining the us and them. That the us are the people who envision the concept of freedom as being inclusive, and to us, America belongs. And to them is the people who want to create an oligarchy. And they're the, dude here. And like other people who are alive today. And trying to redefine that, I think, and defining the us and the them has been the secret of American history. And sometimes it is more successful than others. But as I say, I keep saying this is the moment when we get to recreate America. But what we create is completely unclear right now. And that's why I'm sort of out in the streets trying to, beat people to step up and have a voice, because this is the moment that we get to decide, maybe forever.
I'm going to use Heather, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to use Heather thing to beat people to have a voice, and so I'm inviting you to have a voice. Joe.
Well, thank you for fabulous comments. So I think these statues should come down, be put in museums or in people's houses, but why? Sean and Heather both pointed out Lee was a traitor to the U.S. government. He was a secessionist. He fought against his former government. That is not why I'm against these statues. You could say the same thing about George Washington, was a secessionist, a traitor to England. He fought against England. Now his side won, so they get to tell the story. But imagine that the Civil War were fought over some economic inequality, some unfair taxes from the North. There's no slavery down there. And there was some unfairness that the South rose up against, lost, and rejoined the Union. I wouldn't object to these statues in those cases. What I object to is because this war was fought over slavery. They can say whatever they want, the primary reason is slavery. And I don't think we should have statues to people who fought a war over slavery. Washington was a slave owner. Jefferson was a slave owner. They never fought a war in order to maintain that thing. So to me, it's not the traitorous activities. It's the fact that it was based on slavery, which is just so heinous. Without that, I'd be much less concerned.
I agree with you completely. I think there's a moral analysis that goes a bit deeper than the political analysis about being a traitor or not, right? For example, I went to Kansas this summer, which is a lovely state. And I went to the state house there, and there is this huge, it's not a picture, it's like a painting of John Brown. John Brown incited people to kill slaves. He was a white person who killed slave owners and incited slaves to free themselves. Now this is Kansas, which obviously was admitted as a free state, it wasn't a slave state. But the point is that in a state house, you have someone who was executed by the United States government.
Virginia, he's executed by Virginia.
Virginia, thank you. Yes, sir, Virginia. And that execution was as a criminal. And he's a very polarizing figure, right? In the Kansas Museum of History, which is named that way, I thought it would be the Museum of Kansas History, but the Kansas Museum of History, they have a display, terrorist or hero, about John Brown, right? And I think it plays to this idea that it's the morality of the issue that governs how we remember certain individuals. So I agree.
The mural in the Kansas steakhouse was by John Stuart Curry in the late 1930s. And he was a very charismatic and passionate Republican, which back in those days, Republican in Kansas meant you were a much different thing than today. But he didn't get much criticism for that back in the day. But now people, even up into this century, have been talking about rethinking the murals, maybe taking them down. I'm from Kansas.
You can tell. Go on.
So a lot has been said here. I kind of want to say one thing, then ask a question. I think we're here because a white person died, frankly. If a black woman died, I'm not sure as many people would have cared. The reason people cared about Standing Rock, because white people cared about the pipeline. Really. These issues with Native Americans have been around for a long, long time, and all of a sudden they found a pipeline. Like, oh, that's when we kind of ally. So I still think a lot of this, in one way or another, is still around if you can ally with a white person or a white ally in general. And my other issue...
You're talking about the white woman who was killed in Charlottesville.
Yeah. And my other concern is how we talk to one another. I am a mixed race. I do try to talk to both sides, and both sides kind of don't want to have anything to do with me all the time. And I've had people who are progressive, white, say I am not a mixed race because I don't fit into their categorization, which is a bunch of bull. But there's still a lot of that. You still have pervasive racism. We've been hearing about Trump and the Republicans. It's also on the Democratic side. The New Deal got passed because it was understood, well, it's not meant for black people or the other minority culture, it's only meant for white people. And you have people on the left saying, well, yeah, illegal immigration will hurt those poor black people in the inner cities. You have progressives saying that too. So with all that, how do you deal with a growing population of people who don't fit in any of these categories? And how do you deal with still the pervasive race on both sides of the aisle? Both are different.
Anyway.
I think having allies wherever they are is really important. And I think, one thing I would say is that I've been impressed, I was impressed with young white people who went out to for whatever reason, to protest here in Massachusetts when there was the, whatever group came, the free speech group came, and I thought it was a brilliant strategy to isolate them in this little sector and then put another barbed wire and people around and then another one, and so they got no press, for one thing. And that was that seemed to be a good thing in a way, because that continues to incite people who really are not thinking. But I was impressed with that because I thought maybe people are waking up. Because in the end, it's really about, I buy the us and them. And I buy it in this way. I try to use us all the time in the classroom, that we all are implicated in all of this. And we all have to do something to change it. So do we all have a lot to learn? Yes. And we've absorbed a lot about what to think about this by way of our racialization, our social formation here in the United States. This is only in wine that somebody brought that up. I mean, here, this is their subject, racial formation. This is how we've organized our society, who's on top and who's at the bottom, and let a few people into every little strata. And so I think that's one thing. And I think what we're trying to find ways to press against the limitations of that formation. And it's very difficult because at every moment and phase, there's an attempt to keep and to continue pitting us against one another. So I think, that's what I think. You can't divide yourself.
I don't.
No, you can't. No, you can't. You can't divide yourself, and no one of mixed race heritage can. And mixed race heritage in the United States is obvious in some people and not in others. That's the other thing to remember. Obvious in some and not in others. So the thing is that we have to figure out what really is important and what really is needful what values do we really want to live by? I mean, that's the us and the them. That's where I think we're all us and we're all them. So we have to figure out how we all become us. That's how I think about this. Otherwise, there's nothing left. We're going to be sold off to our basest instincts, as we are now at the present. I mean, I really agree with your analysis about the present moment. I really do.
Well, except I would say that we can't all be us. There has to be a them. I'm perfectly happy to discuss the negatives of us, but right now I see this as a political thing. Who controls government? And one of the things that worries me when we talk about race, dividing things by race, is it does ignore the intersectionality. Do you know that the majority of mass shootings in America, domestic violence. Domestic violence is the hidden cancer in America. It does not make press. The number of attacks on women, it's just unimportant. And you know, every time that I am in a public sphere and I want to say, you know, we must look at the issue of women here, everyone's like, oh yeah, that's a woman's issue. It's like,
It's a human.
these are human issues. And so I worry when we do start to divide things by race or by gender, by, you know, any different category, because it really is a question of how are we going to govern ourselves? What are our principles? And I promise you that I need the same health care he does,
Exactly.
and a very different one than he does. And I'm perfectly happy to join together on those principles of what our government should be doing. And I think there's way more of people who think like me than there are people who think like
The other people.
Eric?
Thank you all for these really thoughtful comments. It's really helpful to hear. I'd love to press the group to try to help us think about boundary cases. Craig mentioned that each of these decisions are contextual. We talked about democracy. Joe's given us one example of maybe if we think someone's fought for slavery but not just happened to be near slavery, then we shouldn't take it down. But I'd love to hear your reflections on boundary cases of, do we take out names from schools or parks? Martin, you mentioned that. Should all the statues of traitors come down? That was something you suggested, Heather. How do we think in broad terms, knowing that they're all local decisions? But can you give us some guidance about boundary cases?
Well, yeah, so I do think that we can't approach this with some one-size-fits-all set of principles, as Craig mentioned earlier. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately too, because the other alternative to removal is contextualization. And I am a proponent for that as well. You know, Mitch, so not just putting more context, putting these monuments within more context. And frankly, I think that context can be done, or that contextualization can be done in memorial parks or whatever. That was really bad. Museums or whatever. So, but you know, Mitch Landrieu in his really eloquent speech explaining the removal of the 4 Confederate statues that talked about the signal that it sent to the 4-year-old African-American girl who was walking by, right? And the potential that those monuments cause for her to question whether or not you know, she was included in American society. Right? But I also think that there's a way that we need to put more monuments in place that celebrate, you know, America in its most inclusive sense, at its you know, finest moment, or in its finest moments. But also, I think that, well, let me just step back and give you a personal example. As I said, I grew up in Virginia, Northern Virginia. So there may not have been as many Confederate memorials as there were in, say, Richmond, but I worked at Arlington National Cemetery, and I would pass. a memorial in Arlington National Cemetery dedicated to Confederate soldiers that was put up by Daughters of Confederacy. But they were really, you know, in a lot of ways it was invisible to me. They were just part of the landscape, right? But I went to a middle school called Luther Jackson Middle School. It's in Fairfax County, Virginia. And I remember I was in the 8th grade, and I remember being in the library, and there was an oil painting of this African-American man, very prominently displayed. And I thought, and I went to the librarian and said, "Who is that?" She said, "Oh, that's Luther Jackson, that's who the school's named after." But she couldn't tell me anything about it. This is back in the 80s. And so I later realized that he was a prominent African-American historian, civil rights activist in Virginia. And Luther Jackson had been built and opened in 1954 as the Negro High School in Fairfax. And then when the schools were integrated in 1965, it became a middle school. Now, I'm in this school, and there are very few African-American students. It was still a predominantly white student body. Now it's much more mixed. But there was no intention on the part of the staff to actually communicate the history of that school to me, or his prominence of place, right, in civil rights history in Virginia. I'm glad to say that now they have a website, right? All the schools in Fairfax County do, and they have like a little history about it. But back in the 80s, that wasn't the case, and so I think that we also need to do much more contextualizing of these spaces of statues, of names, of parts that have some an importance or resonance for, again, those moments when, and for those people who have strived to make America a better place. And I don't think that we have enough of that now. So in some ways, I'm for removal of certainly these Confederate statues, but I'm also for addition, and then with that addition,
Eric, was that what you were getting at by boundaries, or did you mean?
I mean, it's my response.
What do you do about Woodrow Wilson, right?
Right.
That's the sort of thing you have in
Woodrow
mind.
Wilson, it's university names, it's the road statue.
Is it the preponderance of the evidence? Keep Wilson because the preponderance of his career was not about the virile segregationist that he evidently was. It was about the League of Nations and all of that. So because you put these things on the scale and the good things outweigh the bad things, is that how you make the decision?
So, I think the Confederate thing is for me, you're a traitor, you don't get a statue on a public piece of property, I'm done, right? So that for me is easy. But the rest of it, Woodrow Wilson is a great example because I got real issues with Woodrow Wilson. And lots of people don't know that he actually lived close to the South Carolina State House in 1874 in the height of the problems of the Reconstruction in South Carolina. He was an observer, but obviously absorbed it all. But I think that this is where not only the contextualization comes in, but also the recognition of other voices. Because he is our history. He is America's history. The Confederates are not America's history. They're our enemies. He is our history. And if you start to say that everybody's got to be perfect, that rejects what is actually history, because that goes back to your us and them, you know? Some of us have real blind spots. You wonder what 100 years from now they're going to say about our use of fossil fuels in the obvious face of the fact we're destroying this globe. But then you have to say, you know, yeah, he kind of won World War I and did some great stuff in the League of Nations, but oopsie poopsie, you know, had a little bit of a problem.
But this is why it's good to have these conversations, right?
And then you look at each one, but then you contextualize it and put next to him, you know, the people who were trying not just resegregate Washington D.C.
William Monroe Trotter, right? Who black journalist based in Boston who campaigned against the release of Birth of a Nation, right? And Birth of a Nation, of course, was the first film that was screened in the White House.
Wait, but you know, even a statue
During
of Grover Cleveland.
Wilson's administration.
You know, has anyone ever seen a statue of Grover Cleveland? I mean, one must exist, right? I've never seen it. Grover Cleveland desegregated the New York City police force. And, you know, he gets written out of American history because he's not, his people aren't the ones who write the history. But even just something as obvious as that we have statues to Benjamin Harrison, wounds me, but we don't have any to Cleveland.
As far as like, I know I was the anti-principles guy. I just have like two not principles that might be interesting. I think Heather's point about public and private is very important when you're dealing with boundary cases, right? I think that is something that is very relevant. I also think to retrieve something from the Catholic moral tradition about scandal. Scandal exists, you know, if you follow the Thomas sort of thing, right? Is like, there's always two or more types of it. But the one that's interesting is there are things that are permissible to do that are sinful, because they make other people stumble in their faith and in their faith perhaps in our nation. And it might be permissible to leave up Calhoun as a name, but the integrity of Yale depended at that moment on not scandalizing all the people who went to Peter Salary's office and said, this is unacceptable, right? And the message that it sends to their children. And I guess, I mean, Peter had lots of consultation, but the point is nonetheless that it was scandalous to do that thing that's permissible. And I think that helps as another guideline.
John, you have the last word.
So I really appreciate this conversation, which has touched on already on some of the things that I wanted to ask about. What most concerns me about the moment in which we find ourselves, as optimistically as Peter described, the coming down of statues as like a power of the people event. I worry that as the statues come down, there might be a risk of transforming the landscape into a monument to white innocence. And, you know, by removing these blights on the white conscience, having done that, we assume that our conscience is clear. We assume that those monuments that remain are innocent, you know, monuments of virtue. Forgetting that, you know, Washington owned slaves and Jefferson owned slaves, and the American Revolution was precipitated in part by England's cessation of slavery. You know, the history seems to be.
That's taking up a question I raised early on, which is like, you know, once you start removing this, what is the boundary? Like, what happens to our history then? And how do we remember that we're not an innocent nation? So we make complicit. I mean,
We do what Germany does. We remember it. We tell the story. We tell the story to the littlest kids. And tell it and tell it and tell it and take them to the concentration camp and show them. We tell the story.
Or make something like the Pledge of Allegiance, you know? Some kind, that's what it takes, doesn't it? Something that kids recite every day. To make memory, to make history live in memory. You have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it.
Maybe not, though. I mean, isn't history the story of humanity? We're the only organism that tries to make sense of the passage of time. And what are interesting moments are the moments when we are struggling against our opposite. So, you know, if Washington just chopped down that stupid cherry tree, like, he's not very interesting. He's interesting when to me, when he says, not Washington, because sorry, I don't think he's a great thinker, but somebody like Jefferson, whom I loathe, by the way. When he talks about human freedom and he holds slaves, I mean, what's up with that? That's a story. And I sort of think that duality is really important in the way we teach history and the way we study history, because that's what's interesting. You don't want to hear the story about the guy who's got it made from the start. You want to hear about the guy who's struggling against his inner demons in society.
Yeah, but how often is notes in, say, Virginia actually taught in elementary school or in high school? Probably not very often. Go to this section on laws and manners in which he's really trying to reconcile his enslavement of people with his his commitment to Enlightenment principles. Those are the two chapters in that, and I certainly didn't come into contact with it when I was in high school. So I wouldn't go as far as saying something like Pledge of Allegiance, because that sounds to me like indoctrination, but certainly, I think we certainly need to be teaching.
One absolutely last question.
Well, it's not going to help. I feel like one key piece was missing from this tonight, and I recognize we only have an hour. The role of conservative American evangelicalism in the debate over the statues and really every political issue in the country right now. Because I feel like one of you mentioned Trump's election as a direct reaction to Obama's presidency. I come out of an evangelical conservative world, and I know what that means. I'm not evangelical anymore, but frankly, I believe that it's dangerous because it is married to civil religion. Do any of you have any thoughts on this?
So let me start, because that's my area. It depends on what kind. There's evangelicals and there's evangelicals. Okay, Hillary Clinton is an evangelical. She's a leftist evangelical, and then there are conservative evangelicals. So I think it depends on what kind of evangelicals you're talking about. A member of our board for the Blasey Center is the president of Gordon Conwell College, Evangelical College, a lefty, a lefty evangelical, embarrassed by the NEA's support of the current president. So it all depends. I mean, evangelical is somebody who simply believes you have to be born again. So I mean, there are Catholic evangelicals. So it all depends on what you mean. Now, the evangelicals sort of captured the spotlight under Reagan with focus on the family and all that sort of stuff. But that's a specific, very thin, I think, a thin slice of what that much larger and more sort of quite revered tradition in America is about, that goes back to Whitfield and people like that.
And your point is well taken, that that's the one population that has not deserted Donald Trump at all, is the evangelical part of the Republican Party. And that, I look back and just figured that is a story of how that previously unpoliticized body of Americans became so politicized under Reagan and became part of this idea of an authoritarian kind of rule that they are willing to jump on board now. The question is, how many of them are there still? And
they're losing numbers, and also there are that was a strange coalition that was actually helped put together by Catholics. Evangelicals who had become Catholics, like Gil Hudson and people like that. So that's a complicated story. Thank you. Please join me in thanking you very much.